While the death of Prince Aegon loomed over the Red Keep, discontent was hanging heavy over Dragonstone as well, where Rhaena Targaryen had gathered a small court around herself as she took rule of the ancient Targaryen seat. Much as they once had with King Jaehaerys during the Regency, the lords of the surrounding lands, specifically Blackwater Bay, came seeking favour and audience from the Queen in the east. Rhaena was not so welcoming as her brother, as lords, whom arrived seeking an audience received a frosty welcome, and some were met with utter indifference, while others were denied an audience altogether and sent away from Dragonstone, angry and unsatisfied. Queen Rhaena's reunion with one of her young twin daughters, Princess Aerea, proved no happier than her mother returning to the gloomy island of Dragonstone. The young princess scarcely remembered her mother after the turmoil of her uncle Maegor's reign, whilst Rhaena, for her part, neither understood nor possessed much affection for children in general. Some have argued that Rhaena showed signs in her youth she had no desire to be a mother, only than the duty of her position. The two found little warmth in one another. Aerea had adored life at the Red Keep, where the halls teemed each day with lords, ladies and envoys from distant lands, and knights training noisily in the yards below. By night there were singers, fools and mummers to entertain the court, while beyond the castle walls the streets of King's Landing roared with colour, clamour and excitement. Most of all, Aerea had revelled in being acknowledged as heir to the Iron Throne. Great lords and gallant knights courted her favour, while servants, washerwomen and stable boys alike showered her with praise and affection. Surrounded by a wild pack of high-born girls and low-born alike, the princess had become the terror of the castle, thriving amidst the chaos and adoration of the court. Everything Aerea loved had been stripped away when her mother carried her off to Dragonstone, against her wishes. Besides the noise and splendour of King's Landing, the ancient island seemed dreary and lifeless, a place of cold stone, sea winds and endless quiet. There were no girls near her own age within the castle, and she was forbidden from mixing with the fisherfolk children who lived in the villages beneath the Dragonmount. Her mother remained little more than a stranger to her, distant and difficult to understand. At times Rhaena could be stern, at others withdrawn and melancholy, forever brooding over long old griefs. The women of her court showed scant interest in the lonely young princess either. Of all of them, only Alyssa Farman of Fair Isle earned Aerea Targaryen's affection. Alyssa filled the girl's head with tales of voyages and distant seas, promising one day to teach her how to sail. Yet Alyssa herself was restless upon Dragonstone. She longed for the western seas of her home, and spoke often of returning to them. Whenever she did, Aerea would plead, "Take me with you," as Alyssa Farman would only laugh. Dragonstone possessed one thing that the Red Keep could not rival: dragons. Beneath the looming shadow of the Dragonmount, new hatchlings seemed to emerge with every passing moon. The dragon eggs Dreamfire had laid upon Fair Isle had all hatched after being brought back to Dragonstone, and Rhaena took care to introduce her daughter to them. "Choose one and make him yours," she urged Aerea. "One day you will fly." The castle yard held younger dragons, and growing drakes beside, whilst beyond the fortress walls, wild dragons nested in the caves hidden amongst the smoking slopes of the mountains. Aerea had seen Vermithor and Silverwing during her years in King's Landing, but there she had only been permitted to admire them from a distance. On Dragonstone, dragons were everywhere, and she could visit them whenever she wanted. There were the hatchlings no larger than hounds, the young drakes snapping and hissing in their pens, and her mother's pale blue Dreamfire. Above all, however, stood the ancient monsters of another age, long forgotten. Balerion the Blackdread and Vhagar, vast, old, and heavy with the years. They often seemed half asleep beneath the mountain's shadow, yet whenever they stirred, unfurled their colossal wings or loosed a growl from deep within their chests, they remained every bit as fearsome as the legends claimed. In the Red Keep, Aerea had loved her horse, her hounds, her friends. On Dragonstone, the dragons became her friends, her only friends. Aside from Alyssa Farman and she began to count the days until she could mount one and fly far, far away. In 52 AC, King Jaehaerys last undertook his long-delayed royal progress through the Vale of Arryn. His journey carried him from Goldtown to Runestone, Redford, Longbow Hall, and Heartsholme, before he finally flew high above the mountains to the Aerea itself, following the same perilous path Queen Visenya had once taken during the conquest. Queen Alysanne accompanied the king for parts of the journey, though not all of it. She had yet to fully regain her strength after the loss of her child, Prince Aegon, and the grief still lingered heavy upon her. Even so, the queen remained active throughout the progress. Through her efforts, a marriage was arranged between Lady Prudence Celtigar and Lord Grafton of Goldtown, strengthening ties between the Crown and the Vale of Arryn. Alysanne also continued the practice of holding women's courts during the progress, hearing petitions and grievances from women, both high-born and humble alike. One such court was held in Goldtown, another at the Gates of the Moon. What the Queen learned there would leave a lasting mark upon the realm, eventually helping shape changes to the laws of the Seven Kingdoms themselves. Though men in later years would often speak of Queen Alysanne's laws, the phrase is not strictly accurate. Unlike the conqueror's queens Visenya and Rhaenys, Alysanne possessed no true authority to issue decrees, pronounce judgments, or enact laws in her own name. Yet the young queen held immense influence over King Jaehaerys, and more often than not, when Alysanne spoke, the king listened closely, as he did after their return from the Vale. It was through her women's courts that Alysanne became aware of the hardship endured by widows throughout the Seven Kingdoms. In times of peace especially, husbands outlived the wives of their youth. For men, most commonly died upon battlefield, while young women were more often perishing in childbirth. Many widows, high-born and common alike, eventually remarried. Too often, however, the children of the first marriage resented the new wife, and once the husband himself died, those heirs would cast the widow from the household. Noble widows might be stripped of servants, incomes and privileges, while poorer women were reduced to outright destitution. Disturbed by these injustices, Alysanne urged the king to act. In 52 AC, Jaehaerys issued what would become known as the Widow's Law. The decree reaffirmed the inheritance rights of the eldest son or eldest daughter where no son existed, but required heirs to continue supporting any surviving widow in the condition she had enjoyed during her husband's life. A lord's widow could no longer be driven from her home, deprived of her servants, clothing or income, simply because her husband had died. At the same time, the law addressed abuses from the opposite direction as well. Lords were forbidden from disinheriting the children of an earlier marriage in favour of a later wife or her offspring, ensuring the inheritance could not be reshaped at a whim to satisfy new ambitions or affections. Building occupied much of King Jaehaerys' attention that year. Construction on the Dragon Pit continued steadily upon the Hill of Rhaenys, and the king frequently rode out himself to inspect the progress of the great work. Yet, during his journeys between Aegon's High Hill and the Dragon Pit, he became increasingly aware of the miserable state of the city itself. King's Landing had swollen too quickly, growing wild and disorderly beneath the shadow of the Red Keep. Manses, shops, hovels, and foul rat pits had sprung up everywhere like mushrooms after the rain. The streets were narrow, dark, and choked with filth, while buildings leaned so closely together that a man might climb from one window to the next without even touching the ground. Crooked alleyways twisted through the city like a drunken serpent, and everywhere the air carried the stink of mud, dung, and overflowing night soil. What that I could empty the city, knock it down, and build it all anew, King Jaehaerys once lamented to his small council, but such a task lay beyond even a king's powers. The crown lacked the wealth required for such a vast undertaking. Instead, Jaehaerys resolved to improve what he could. The foulest hovels and rat pits were torn down, and at the heart of the city, a broad square was carved out and planted with trees, ringed by markets and covered arcades. From this new centre stretched long thoroughfares, broad and straight as a spear shaft, the King's Way, the God's Way, the streets of the Sister, and Blackwater Way, though the small folk soon took to calling the last the Muddy Way instead. The transformation of King's Landing could not be completed in a single year. The work continued for decades, but it was in 52 AC, by the order of King Jaehaerys himself, that the rebuilding first began. The The undertaking placed still greater strain upon the royal treasuries, worsening tensions already surrounding the crown's master of coin, the Pentoshi merchant prince Rego Draz. In a remarkably short span of years, the so-called Lord of Air had become almost as hated as the man who held the office before him, though for very different reasons. Many accused Rego Draz of corruption, claiming he linted his own purse with the king's gold. Draz treated such accusations with open mockery. "Why should I steal from the king? I am twice as rich as he is," he reportedly replied. Others despised him for his foreign gods. Though many strange faiths were practiced in Pentos, Rego was known to keep only a single idol within his household, a grotesque figure shaped like a pregnant woman with swollen breasts and head of a bat. Asked about it, he would often say, "She is all the god I need." Nor did the small folk forgive him for being foreign-born. Like many Pentoshi, Rego's blood mixed Andal, Valyrian, and older forgotten peoples descended from slaves and settlers of ages past. Yet, more than anything else, the realm resented his staggering wealth, which he made no effort to conceal. He rode in a gilded palanquin, dressed himself in silks, and adorned his hands with ruby rings, flaunting riches beyond many of the great lords. Even Rego Draz's enemies admitted that he was a masterful steward of coin. The combined burning of the completing of the Dragon Pit and the remaking of King's Landing strained the royal treasury beyond what existing taxes could bear. The levies upon spice, silks, and castle building brought wealth enough, but not nearly enough sufficient for the work on the scale Jaehaerys had in mind. Reluctantly, the Pentoshi Master of Coin introduced yet another tax, this one upon the gates of the city itself. Henceforth, all who entered or departed King's Landing were required to pay a fee to the guards posted at the gates. Additional charges were laid upon horses, mules, donkeys, and oxen, while wagons and carts were taxed most heavily of all, given the endless streams of merchants, travellers, and small folk blowing through the capital each day. The gate tax soon proved enormously profitable, filling the crown's coffers with more than enough coin to sustain the king's ambitions. Yet the measure came at a cost to Lord Rego personally, already distrusted and widely disliked. The Lord of Air found himself blamed for every copper demanded at the city gate. The muttering against him, loud before, grew louder still, until resentment towards the wealthy Pentoshi increased tenfold throughout King's Landing.